I'm joined today. I have the great honor of interviewing someone who is always on the other side of the interview camera, Pascal Lottaz from Switzerland. Thank you very much for being here, Pascal.
Thank you very much for having me today.
So Pascal, I think many people who are watching this will already know him. He is the skipper, the captain of the Neutrality Studies channel, which garners hundreds of thousands of views for his videos regularly. He interviews people from around the world who are interested in peace, in staying out of proxy wars, in uh, sane international relations. He's one of the pioneers of neutrality studies and associate professor of international relations at Kyoto University. So he's a little bit down the road from where I am here in Kashiwa. And he did his graduate work in Japan as well, the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, which I think is that Roppongi, the one near the art museum? I think I've been to that museum many times. So welcome, Pascal. Thank you so much for being here. And I thought we might start with a bit of a jiko shokai, a self-introduction in Japan. If you could just talk a little bit about how you became interested in neutrality studies. I know being from Switzerland, it's maybe part of your political DNA, and how you ended up in Japan and how you decided to make this study of neutrality a cornerstone of your academic career.
It's interesting that you would ask that in this, like, together, like neutrality in Japan, because that's actually what happened to me and why I ended up now doing neutrality studies here. Because going out of Switzerland and coming to Japan for my PhD back in 2014, I had a completely different idea for what to work on in the PhD. My original idea was to follow up on something I did in my master's degree, and which I wouldn't do anymore today, by the way, knowing what I know now. But in my master's degree, I wrote about the responsibility to protect. And back then I was like relatively positive toward the concept, and today I understand, oh no, that was another one of those Trojan horses. But
Right.
okay, we live and we learn. And then for other reasons, kind of that project didn't work out very quickly. Like after half a year, and I understood it wouldn't make sense to work on that. And I didn't have a topic to work on for the PhD there in the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Roppongi. Luckily, though, I was doing a seminar. I was taking the seminar of a very quite famous Japanese professor who then became my Dr. Father, Kitaoka Shinichi. And Professor
Very famous man.
Kitaoka,
Wow.
he's a famous man. He's a famous historian. And he's famous for being a rather right-wing, it's not right. He's not right-wing in the European sense, but he's like a conservative thinker. Somebody with whom I don't always agree, but the wonderful thing about him is that he's a real historian. The National Graduate Institute is this place that is very much into US kind of IR.
Right.
So they care a lot about variables, independent variable, dependent variable, intervening variables, put them in an order, make a framework, and then go and analyze those and da. And I even framed my initial research like that, and I pitched it to Professor Kitaoka, and he said, "You know what? I never understood the variables. Just tell me what happened." And I was very
True
happy
historian, right?
true historian. That's exactly what I wanted to do, because he pointed out to me one thing in the seminar. He said, like, Pascal, we actually don't really know what happened in the Second World War between Japan and the European neutrals. Or he said, I've never read about that. We don't know what that was about. And I thought, that's curious. So I looked into that for a seminar paper and saw, like, indeed, nobody had bothered to look at either Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, Turkey, and what their relationship was with Japan. I mean, those were the five big neutrals. And so I ended up actually saying, like, fine, this sounds like something for me to do. I'm from Switzerland. I speak German and French. I can read those. I can read Spanish more or less, and I will find a way to deal with Swedish. Let me do this. So I picked that and said, I'm going to use these three countries as case studies, Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland, and look at their foreign relations with Japan. And one thing that became then clear over time to me was that although these were three different neutrals, I mean, Spain and Sweden, Switzerland and Sweden, they kind of go together. They have similar similar but slightly different historical trajectories of how they became neutral.
Right.
But Spain was an entirely different kind of neutral. Spain was a fascist dictatorship by 1941 when the war between Japan and the US broke out because of what happened with Francisco Franco, the Civil War, and so on. But the point was that for 41 to 45, the fact that Spain remained neutral and officially said so and didn't actually engage in the fighting enabled Spain to do almost exactly the same thing in and with Japan as Switzerland and Switzerland and Sweden could do. And that was fascinating to me, the fact that regime type doesn't matter at all, the fact that diplomacy works as long as there's no war, and diplomats do what diplomats do, and foreign offices do what foreign offices do as long as there's no war, even if everybody else is engulfed in war. That was fascinating and eye-opening. And also that they cooperated among each other, the Swiss, the Swedes, and the Spanish, in order to do things like organize exchange ships. Because even during the Second World War, even while the fighting was going on, Japan and the US still had common interests.
Right.
For instance, getting each other's diplomats back and getting prisoners of war back, which is something that we also see currently between Ukraine and Russia, right? Although they are fighting, there's still certain areas of common interest. And that's the place then where both of them try to ask mediators, third parties. And it's a very complex thing, because each one of the parties, US and Japan, they ask different neutrals to help them in vis-a-vis the other one.
Right.
So the Japanese asked the Spaniards because they had a better relationship to Franco than to Bern, and the Americans asked the Swiss, but the Swiss and the Spanish then started cooperating and making things happen, and the Swedes entered the picture, and it was a very complex and dynamic system. And I realized that there's a much bigger story to tell about neutrality than what I, as a Swiss, thought it was about a country that says I'm not going to participate and not going to join anything. I'm gonna be a little porcupine and just not do anything. That's not what neutrality was. And the more that I looked at the history of the development of neutrality, also in international law and as a norm and diplomatically, but also as a practice of statecraft, I just figured out there's a huge story to tell, and I can dedicate my academic life to that, and that's what I'm doing. And it has been fun. It's one of the most understudied things ever, for a very good reason. I mean, for people who study wars, why would you look at those who don't fight wars? So they usually fall by the wayside. But there's stories to tell here.
I think what you're doing is fascinating, and it's resonating with people around the world. I mean, I watch your channel. There are people from India. Recently, you had people from Armenia. I mean, you've had scholars from, around the world. It's really every country that you could conceive of is interested in not getting involved in proxy wars. So many things I want to pick up on what you said, and we have just a little bit of time. One thing that stood out to me in what you just said was the complexity of international relations. It's dynamic, it's evolving, there's always something new that comes up and you have to deal with it. And I wondered, I'm thinking back my own life. I come from the United States, and when for the past, I guess it was 25 years now or longer, or I suppose for my entire life, the United States has dealt with complexity at a government level by dropping bombs. And in a way, that makes things very easy to understand for a population that is not necessarily interested in complexity. So when you have a war going on, it's black and white, and the other guy is bad, and we are absolutely good. And that's a very easy thing to sell to people. I was reading a book recently about Charlemagne, about the Charlemagne's diplomacy with surrounding Muslim states. And the diplomats at that time were very little has changed, I think. Of course, they were going back and forth, they were walking or on horses. It's not the same as Zoom meetings today, but they were trying to handle a great deal of complexity in real time, and they didn't really have the option of just bombing people. They had to deal with it. I wonder if there's a way to get back to diplomacy as the art of managed complexity in a world in which it's so easy. There's so much vested in monetary interests and government interests and political interests. There's so much vested in just ending complexity by starting a war? Is there a way to get back to a truly neutral stance among states where we don't get involved in proxy wars, we don't kill each other, and we just let the other guy alone? Is that possible, do you think?
I hope it is. I tend to look at war as kind of the equivalent on the species level to what cancer is on a biological body level.
Hmm.
It makes no sense. We're killing our own, and we are an 8 billion people planet, and we keep eradicating members of our own species.
Hmm.
This is an
True.
incredibly dumb thing to
It's
do.
true.
And the thing is, just like cancer, if war spreads, we by now have the means in order to kill the body completely. If
Hmm.
we decide to go all out, then this cancer of war is gonna be the end of the whole body politic and the body of humanity, right?
Hmm.
Um, so we are not the first ones to realize that. I mean, the dream of perpetual peace has been dreamt by Immanuel Kant, has been around for a long time, because intuitively we understand that violence is a very bad way of doing politics, right? We understand that, but sometimes we are just apparently unable to avoid it, whether it's on an interpersonal level when like a kid behaves so poorly that you just slap it or something. I mean, it's even if it's something that you don't want to do, it is something that happens.
Hmm.
Because at some point people break, and we have like several reasons why things go violent. Now, we also had several approaches at trying to manage that, and we need to keep that in mind, right? I mean, the League of Nations and also the United Nations are very laudable and great um, um, exercises in trying to constrain our war-making potential as a humanity. And if you read what the idealists wrote, in the 1920s and so on, dreaming of like really now going to use the League of Nations as a tool to finally bring peace
Right.
to Earth. I mean, it's a very good dream. And the thing is, it didn't work for 100 years. And the thing to realize here is that the system that we've tried over the last 100 years is a top-down system, right? We
Right.
try to create a top institution and then implement Kant's dream of perpetual peace.
Hmm.
We have other systems that are even older. The 19th century, the people who met in 1815 in Vienna, they said, like, you know what we need is a balance of power, and then we get somewhere. Now, the 19th century was not a peaceful century, and it was not a non-violent century. It was actually there were interstate wars, and there was,
Right.
of course, horrendous violence against the colonies and the
Right.
colonized peoples of the global south, as we would call them today. So it was not at all peaceful, but the idea was a different one back then. And the
Hmm.
idea was let's make a system in which we have a security architecture, we would call it today, that interlocks and makes sure that nobody can go to war with somebody else. Now we are entering, as we speak, into a new era of multipolarity and
Right.
at best a balance of power, right? Because we are seeing how the US is not able to dictate anymore what's going to happen. And we have states like Russia and China who just can do things that would have been unthinkable 30 years ago at the end of the Cold War. And within that framework, I think neutrality has a space again, because neutrality is basically an approach at taking away oxygen from war
Hmm.
by removing parts that could be sucked into the war. So
Okay.
it's quite simple. The more small states or the more states remain neutral in a conflict, the more the conflict remains confined to a relatively small area.
Hmm.
It's the opposite logic of alliances, right? An alliance is like an attack against one is an attack against all, so everybody will end up in a war. It's what basically got us made the First World War the First World War. A tiny little BS thing happening
In the
in
Balkans.
Sarajevo
Right.
in the Balkans
Right.
that then became a wildfire, right? Because it sucked in everybody else. And the idea of states remaining neutral is to bring peace by not going to war. And the more states participate in that, or the more states that take themselves out, the more war will remain constrained. The horrible thing is, of course, that this idea accepts that war is a given fact and that some states will end up at war, but at least we won't have a big one. So
Hmm.
we kind of isolate the cancer and keep it there without making it, not letting it spread to the entire human body, right? And these are actually also old ideas, and other thinkers wrote about this before, especially in the late 19th century.
Hmm.
The whole idea also of buffer states and cordon sanitaire.
Right.
That's that idea, that we keep military conflagrations as small as possible. But it runs counter to that narrative of good versus evil and just war theory.
Right.
Just
Mm.
there is no space for neutrality in just war theory.
Mm.
There's space for neutrality in like 19th century Clausewitzian type of thinking of war
Right.
as the continuation of politics by other means. So it really depends on how people conceptualize warfare,
Mm.
on whether or not they would give neutrality a chance. The thing is, today, especially in the global south, a lot of states just didn't swallow this ideological pill that the Americans, Europeans are offering with like good versus evil. And if you don't join us, you're on the side of the other one. And
Right.
they're claiming their own space, especially India now is
Mm.
claiming the space
Right.
as a non-involved power. And you now deal with me. And they are also powerful enough these days to do that. So I do think that we are seeing now the return of that kind of realist neutrality, even if it comes under another name, non-involvement, non-alignment, multi-alignment, call it what you want, but it's the basic idea is still the same of like not just blindly participating in one or the other alliance.
I wonder how this all looks when we take a few steps farther back and look at global history and say the past 500 years or more, where attempts to have global peace have almost necessarily been a product of European interactions. You mentioned before 1815, and in our previous conversations, you've mentioned 1648 and so forth, and then we just discussed World War I and the Balkans. I think perhaps you might disagree, but it seems as though with American and European dominance of the world over the past 500 years, it seems as though that has tended to skew these ideas of world peace. Whereas recently, and just watching your channel, you get a sense of this, is the people in countries that we now call the global south are rising up and saying, we reject this entire system just from soup to nuts. We're not going to be a part of these global games anymore. India is a great example. Recently, Japan, the new Prime Minister Ishiba Sensei suggested an Asian NATO, which was roundly booed. I mean, it was suggested quite a long time ago by uh, politicians in Japan, and there's really no detail about it, who's going to join this and so forth. Well, India stood up immediately and said, "Sorry, no, we're not going to be a part of this." So global South countries are, I think, increasingly, they're saying, no, we just reject the whole thing entirely. Is there a way in which we're at a point now in history? I get this sense, and maybe you feel it's a little different, where Anglo-European dominance of the world is just ending, and you know, the United States is falling apart internally, and Europe is embroiled in, another endless war in Ukraine, which looks to expand, metastasize, to follow the cancer metaphor anytime. Does the global south now rise up and just take over the world, not take over the world, but say that we're not going to play these power politics games anymore. We're going to do things differently. What do you think?
I think that's exactly what we're seeing. You're completely right about this. And it's not that the global south is now getting together, getting up and like doing their own alliance or kind of third
Right,
way or whatever. It's just they don't participate. They say like,
right,
okay, you know what? You put sanctions on Russia, fine, but I'm gonna take from Russia whatever I can. And if you put secondary sanctions on me, then okay, I'm gonna do whatever I can, but I'm neither happy with it nor am I going to implement all of these things.
right,
I'm going to find ways around. And you can even see how it's not working anymore, right? You can see
right,
how the Europeans are now buying oil from the Indians
right.
that they got from crude that they got from Russia originally, and refine it and put it over there. It's like it's not working,
It's
and
absurd.
this
It's
is
absurd.
absurd. So the what we're seeing is now that the global south is having more structural importance, right?
Mm,
um for the violence that was done to the colonies, that goes 400 years back for the Philippines, even 500 years, right?
mm,
Was always being hugely exploited and having no political say over your own resources and your own territories. That then transformed in one way or another in the but only in the 1950s, right? And it transformed in very uneven ways.
mm,
While Southeast Asia got at least more or less real political freedom, even though some structures of abuse were still in place, and some people got regime changed, like in Indonesia when leaders didn't play along. They at least politically were more or less independent. For Africa, neocolonialism was rampant in the way that, okay, you have now a nominal black leaders in your countries, but all of your means of production still belong to the West, and all we can still extract what we want. And if you don't follow along, then we just take away the money from the leaders, and then we have other people coming in. I mean, the structures that were used in order to still control economically these countries were huge. And so just think about the fact that even today, 14 African states still use the franc, the French,
franc, yes.
What it has a special name, but the colonial franc. It's like the French are still printing the goddamn money of these states. They were not able to get out of that because of dependencies, right? It's like, it's not that they want that and that the population wants it, but you create a structure that leaves basically no other choice. So, and this is now also changing. Even with these countries in the Sahel that had, like, well, you know, military coups and say, like, we're not playing along. The French get out, and Americans don't even think about coming in, and they're starting to interact with the Chinese and the Russians, and that is something that was not possible before. And the fact that it's happening now will just make the world even more complex. It also makes it more dangerous because, as you pointed out, the Europeans and the Anglo-Saxons, we have a habit of just bombing people when we don't agree with them, and make up a story while we go, even if it's absolute nonsense, like weapons of mass destruction. But we do it because what the leaders in Europe and North America understand is that politics is the art of narrative control of the current 6 weeks. Everything older than 6 weeks is history, so you don't need to care about it. And I cannot fathom any European leader who ever got persecuted for lying about a war. The only war crime in Europe that lands you in prison or gets you killed is losing a war. That's the only ones, like Milosevic and Hitler and so on. I mean, only if you actually lose a big war, you die. Otherwise, you're fine. And the fact that the British and that the Americans all never really lost the war in the way that others lost keeps these elites safe. And that is this impunity that we're seeing, and it's the impunity that Israel is currently also using, because they know that that they have Big Brother's unlimited support, and that is something that, historically speaking, has worked out very, very well over the last 200-300 years. So yes, your observation is right. I mean, I think we are not only at a change, at an inflection point that's going to be different from, like, the Cold War. We're at an inflection point where we're coming out of 500 years of European domination of the world, and the world is now saying, like, finally, we don't have to do this anymore. And luckily for us, so far, I haven't heard anyone who wants revenge. I think we need to be very happy about the fact that revenge doesn't seem to be a motivating factor. It's just like they want to have a bigger say in what's going to happen in the future, because, like, boy oh boy, did we do criminal stuff around the world, like of the most horrible kind, and we are not even aware of it. Any European and Americans, I mean, Americans will tell you, but most Americans will tell you that they never did colonies, right? They're not a colonial power. That's a European thing.
The United States is a colony.
It is a colony. Yeah, exactly. They will say, like, oh, we know the struggle of the colonies because we came out. It's like, okay, fantastic. And the Europeans will tell you about colonialism, but colonialism that happened, like, years ago, like millions of years, like distant past. It's like feudalism. I mean, we know it happened, but it's not on the mind of these people of just how much of a horrendous crime and structural element it was and still is in the way that the world works. And that ignorance still fuels a lot of the current way of doing things, especially in Europe, and perceiving the rest of the world.
There's every time I listen to you talk, I just nod along, and I think this is fantastic. What you've mentioned now about revenge is something I've thought of many times. I've been in Asia for a long time, and go around Asia, and you just sort of can feel in your skin what has happened here. And I imagine it's the same in other places in the world as well, in Africa and so forth. You can just feel the terror. I grew up in the American South, and of course we didn't own slaves at the time, but you can feel in the cultural atmosphere that there was great terror in this place, that this is where people bled and were killed, and there was great suffering. You're right, there aren't calls for violence. I mean, in Japan, remarkably, the American ambassador politicizes the Holocaust at Nagasaki, and the press covers for him here. It's almost bizarre the extent to which there is no call for vengeance. But I wonder if there isn't something that can be done. You know, the what you mentioned about, I call it the Washington way of war, but it's been a European hallmark for millennia, is that you simply destroy the other person. I mean, you're seeing it now in Israel, in Gaza. The other person has no right to exist. I mean, it's the Punic War all over again. It's not that you have some sort of objective and you achieve it and then it ends. The objective is simply to eradicate the other person from the face of the earth. The reason that we call Romania Romania is because the Romans didn't like the people that were living there, and they just sort of, cleared them out. And the reason that we're talking about white working people in the United States right now is because the people that were there before have all been killed. It's not as though it's a natural phenomenon that there are white people in North America. It is a colony. The entire continent, North and South, is a colony. And we sort of skip by that and say, oh, well, that happened a long time ago. But I wonder if there isn't a way to square accounts with the past in some way. Haiti is a good example of a place that's been reduced to poverty by design. You mentioned Africa, the currencies that are still printed in France, for goodness sake, in the 21st century, and the structural rape of resources from every corner of the globe by the United States, by big powers. Is there a way for neutrality studies especially, it seems to me that there is a moral obligation to come to terms with the past before we can shake hands and say, from here on out, we're going to deal fair and square. What do you think about this? Or is this just too big a rabbit to pull out of the hat?
No, it's a rabbit that's being pulled out of the head on a daily or monthly basis. I mean, we have a lot of good research. We have people who do fantastic work on this, like in University of Linköping, P.O. Hansen, who wrote a really great book about Eurafrica and the way that the whole European Union, while presenting itself as a peace project in Europe, was still like fueled by colonialism, right? I mean, Algeria and so on, and they didn't oppose the French bloody wars there. As it was like, colonialism is also like built even into the European Union's DNA. I mean, and all of this research, we have great people who do. On Haiti, I interviewed a Haitian researcher who did fantastic work also on the political processes in Haiti in the Cold War and right after that. So it is there. The thing is that it doesn't enter mainstream narratives. I mean, to be humble though, I mean, it is difficult for academic research to really, kick off in a way that only a few historians, for instance, can. I mean, Emmanuel Todd. I'll speak to him soon, and he is well received. And then you have people like Jeffrey Sachs and John Mearsheimer, whose books get reception. I mean, they are not historians, but their research gets popular reception. But
Piketty and so forth. Piketty and so forth. People like that who write big books, right?
Big books, and some of them become popular, but they're always just like, it's just a drop on a hot stone, right? It dissipates again, and it doesn't really change the general perception of people about the structures, the power structures of the moment, and how they connect to these pasts. And every once in a while, those, when they do, they also even get co-opted into the next power structure that we're seeing. I mean, you can see in the United States how now, I mean, the US fairly and squarely accepts that what happened with the blacks from who were brought from Africa as slaves, that was not okay, that was wrong, and the racism was wrong, and it was very important that you got out of this. But you're the one who said, like, yeah, I mean, the civil war in the US is being dumped down to a question about slavery, when in fact there was so much more going on.
Right.
And the the way that then the current narrative tries to also use this and use slogans like, oh, we need equal number of white and black people in the military in order to be patriotic, and things like that, or how the gay issue and LGBTQ are being integrated now into and co-opted into you thinking that having gay people in the military and the Navy and the Air Force is a wonderful thing. And this is proof now that we are an inclusive society. If the bombs are just rainbow colored, they're gonna kill
Yep.
people much more equitably and much more inclusively.
Yes. It's a sick joke, actually.
It's a
It's a very
sick
sick
joke.
joke. Yeah.
It's a sick joke, but the systems of power are, when we have a system of power,
Right.
like what the US managed to build up, then necessarily it has the tools and it has the capacity to suck up
Right.
inconvenient narratives and twist them around and use them again. So naturally, this is what you would expect. So the problem is not the research. The problem is the way that it then in a sociological process is either ignored or twisted around in
Right.
order again to serve this the power structure. And it's not a conspiracy. It's just like, it's just what you would expect, what would happen
Right.
if you have people in power and certain systems that are working, right? They preserve themselves naturally. But and that's the big important point now, is like, those systems are not all encompassing anymore.
Right. Right.
It's getting smaller by virtue of others getting bigger. So these narratives now travel, and they, you have other groups and people who receive and then also jointly think about what
Right.
happened. And in this sense, the discourse is widening, and the fact that we can have this global dialogue through the
Right.
media we've got available, that's a good thing. Which is also why I think the
Hmm.
crackdown is happening now. Just 2 days ago, our colleague Glenn Deason was banned from YouTube, and
Oh my
he's also
goodness.
an academic. Yeah, my goodness, and he did academic stuff. He interviewed Dugin and other thinkers, and that's YouTube said, like, oh, we detected hate speech, deleted, not a single example. And this is coming for us, but that's also what was to be expected.
This circles back to what we discussed at the beginning about complexity. These ideas of everything is either hate speech or a conspiracy theory, when people put their finger on the complexity in the world, that it simply isn't the case that every Russian is a devil. It simply isn't the case that everybody in Ukraine is an angel, and we have to take the side of good or evil in these struggles that really have no moral component when you look at least from Washington's perspective. This is pure power politics at the point of a gun. To get back to what you're saying about the situation in the United States and slavery, the narrative control is so great that even Black Americans who talk about reparations, and I think reparations is a very complex issue for many reasons. There are many Black Americans who don't want reparations as a matter of dignity. I think we should respect those choices. But there has been such structural racism in the United States that has taken so much wealth and dignity away from people for so many generations that it seems only, as a human being, it seems only fair to try to make things right in some way. But even Black Americans, at least as far as I've heard, almost never mention the tens of millions of people who were abducted from Africa and what that did to Africa, taking those people away from the African continent. I mean, of course, what happened in the United States with slavery was horrific. That was also a horrific abuse of human rights. But the fact that those people were abducted from Africa, leaving Africa without a population, a male population, for 500 years, that was also traumatic. So the narrative is such that even people who want to pierce the veil of whatever we're being told now, the past 6 weeks, have trouble doing so. I know we have just a few minutes left. The final question just is about this narrative control. Glenn Deason's now been banned. You mentioned before in your channel that Africa Stream has been banned. I know that someone I've interviewed on this channel, Scott Ritter, he's been harassed endlessly by the State Department, by the FBI, by the the the, the federal government, which is increasingly fascist, showing up at his house, harassing his family. People who are pro-lifers in the United States get visited by the FBI, guns drawn 6:30 in the morning. You know, YouTube is a good way to fight back, but YouTube is also a battlefield. YouTube is not neutral
No.
at all. And you've been recently going to Rumble, I think. Is that how we do this? Is that how we fight this war? Is that we just keep outflanking the enemy who wants to control the narrative? And
Yeah, I
who is
mean,
the enemy? Who are these people?
It's not one group or one defined thing. I mean, it's again, it's a system. I mean, just think of the there's so many turning, spinning wheels that interlock and that then create what we have. And you have a couple of like important and powerful ones: Elon Musk, Donald Trump, Joe Biden. These are powerful wheels, but even they are just wheels, and they interlock with the others, right?
Mm.
But then that creates what we see. And YouTube, for instance, YouTube is a huge platform, right?
Mm.
Billions of people watch stuff there. It's like the biggest potential audience, which is why it is such a wonderful megaphone for people like us to try to, reach others and say like, hey, A, you're not alone. B, here is something that we can add to help you with in your either knowledge about what's happening or analysis about the world. But naturally, YouTube needs to be careful with what it does, right? I mean, there is legitimately malevolent actors like
Right.
who would love to use YouTube to scam stuff, right? And
That's true.
automated bots that will post like advertisements and ads everywhere, and that has the potential to destroy the platform.
Right.
I completely understand that, and you might not want somebody who you don't want these things that then are like parasites, the people who also write these stupid email things like about the prince from Saudi Arabia who wants to marry and then just send me $500 and you got to I mean,
right.
there are stupid people like that. So you need to have a system against this. And then that system will like little by little might become smaller. And YouTube has very carefully crafted policies, right? But we don't know who makes these policies, who are the decision makers, and we don't know how they're implemented. We don't know. YouTube cannot do this with humans, right? So they use automated processes, and we don't know if there's a bias. We don't know if there are CIA backdoors. Probably there is. We don't know how they interact. I mean, thanks to the Twitter files and Matt Taibbi, we know that there was direct government involvement with the censorship department at Twitter. So there's a lot of gray area, and the gray area then abuses the legitimate mechanisms that these platforms need to build in order to maintain a coherent structure. And where I want to go with this is that it's getting smaller and smaller, right? And then what now Glenn Deason was told, we've detected hate speech, we deleted your entire channel, no right to appeal, and you can never come back to the platform as a person, as Mr. Deason. You're banned as Mr. Deason.
Wow.
Yeah, it just can happen to me too. I mean, my channel, your channel, what we are seeing here, it's just a checkbox in an Excel spreadsheet, right? You take away the checkbox, we're gone. That's the power of this thing. But then, what does this mean? It means that we have to migrate to other options, to what is available. So to X, to Rumble, to BitChute, and whatever there is, and flow around it. And then the system will try to crack down on that. And we've seen these ideas in the US with a censorship bureau that then actually flags people who would get simultaneously kicked off from all social media platforms. But that one luckily didn't come true, at least not to that degree. But these ideas are there, and it's like a cat and a mouse game. The good thing for us is that the cat is maybe not getting smaller, but there's other corners that are still available. The structural problem we have when it comes to free speech is that the other corners are not necessarily free speech corners either. I mean, the Chinese corner of the internet, I tried to upload my videos on Bilibili, their version of YouTube. They got immediately deleted. It's like, okay, the Chinese don't want political speech either. And the Russians are not famous for that either. So the structural problem we have is that the big power centers and the technological power centers are actually quite anti-free speech. But there's So we just have to find other ways and outlets. And one thing we are seeing right now is the return of mailing lists. I mean,
Hmm.
people are understanding the power of being directly connected to the mailboxes of others, unfiltered. And that's why also Substack and some other mailing list apps are getting more popular.
Hmm.
Because it's not a happy thing to happen because we cannot trust these platforms anymore to actually be fair to us. But it's just a natural reaction to how we, who just, let's call us dissidents, we just don't agree with the current narrative and the current analysis,
Yeah.
how we then try to uh, interconnect and maintain some sort of network. And this is going to go on. It's a cat and mouse game, and it's probably going to get worse soon. But
Yeah.
maybe we got to go through that. There's no getting around unless we are lucky and things open up again.
Well, watching your channel, Neutrality Studies, gives me a great deal of hope because, to continue the metaphor, there are a lot of mice. There's only a few cats, but there are a lot of mice, and they're very clever, and they're learning how to work together, at least to talk to one another, so that they don't feel intimidated, as they're the only one trying to fight this big beast in the other corner. Pascal, thank you so much for taking the time today. Please keep doing your work. I think it's fascinating, and I love watching your videos. The number of people watching them grows day by day, and I encourage everybody watching this to go to the Neutrality Studies channel and check it out. Just start watching. You won't be disappointed. Thank you so much, Pascal. And we're both in Japan, so I think I'll see you again sometime soon. Looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, Jason. We'll go for a beer soon.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.